They stole his sisters. Society rejected their love. But when a stranger arrived with a secret from the past, this solitary man discovered that fate had one final surprise waiting for him. The moment Jara Mundine saw her step down from that dusty truck, something inside him shifted. It was as if the earth beneath his feet had moved, though he stood perfectly still. He would later understand that this was the moment his life split in two, everything that came before and everything that would follow. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what fate had in store for this solitary man, we must first understand the depth of his loneliness. Jara was 32 years old in the summer of 1963, and he had been alone for longer than he cared to remember. Not simply unmarried or without companions, but truly, profoundly alone in a way that had carved itself into his bones. He worked as a stockman on Millbrook Station in the Northern Territory, one of the largest cattle properties in the region. His reputation was beyond reproach. He could track a lost beast through country that would confuse the most experienced drover. Horses responded to his presence as if he spoke their secret language. Yet every evening Jara returned to a solitary hut at the edge of the workers' quarters. While other men gathered to play cards and share tobacco, he sat alone with a kerosene lamp and his memories. His mother had been the first to leave him. Fever had taken her at the mission where they had been forced to relocate when Jara was just 8 years old. He still remembered the smell of eucalyptus leaves she would crush between her palms, the songs she hummed while preparing food, the way her eyes held stories that stretched back to the dreaming itself. His father had been next. Unable to bear the grief, he had simply walked back into country one morning and never returned. Some said the land had reclaimed him. Others whispered that he had chosen to follow his wife into the next world. Jara never knew the truth. He only knew that he had woken one day to find himself responsible for his 2 younger sisters at 12 years of age. For 5 years, he had protected them. Miriam was 10 and Ruth was only 6 when their mother passed. Jara became everything to them: brother, father, provider. He worked any job the mission would give him. He made sure they ate before he did. He told them stories at night, the same stories their mother had told. And then the welfare officers came. Jara was 17 when it happened. He was working in the fields that morning when he heard the screaming. He dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, his heart pounding with a terror he could not name. He arrived to find Miriam and Ruth being dragged toward a government vehicle. Miriam was fighting, kicking, calling his name over and over. Ruth was silent, her small face frozen in shock, clutching a worn blanket that had belonged to their mother. Jara ran toward them, but 2 men held him back. He struggled against their grip, screaming at them to stop. One of the officers said something about protection, about giving the girls a better life. The words meant nothing. All Jara could see was the terror in Miriam's eyes. The vehicle began to move. Jara broke free and ran after it. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed in the red dust of the road, screaming their names until his voice broke. The vehicle disappeared over the horizon, carrying with it the last remnants of his family. He never saw them again. Years passed. Jara grew from a broken teenager into a quiet, capable man. He left the mission and found work on cattle stations, building a reputation for skill and reliability. He saved money and hired people to search for his sisters. Every lead ended in nothing. He learned that Ruth had passed away at 14 in a mission in South Australia. They said it was illness. Jara believed it was heartbreak. Of Miriam, he could discover nothing. She had vanished into the system completely. In his hut he kept a carved wooden box that held the only treasures he possessed. A smooth stone his mother had given him, a feather his grandfather had prepared for a ceremony, and a small woven bracelet made of native grasses that had slipped from Miriam's wrist as they dragged her to the vehicle. He had found it in the dust after they were gone, and he had kept it close ever since. This was the weight Jara carried every day of his life. This was why he had accepted that happiness was not meant for people like him. And then she arrived. Margaret Louise Whitford stepped down from the supply truck on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and Jara felt his carefully constructed walls begin to tremble. She had honey-colored hair that caught the harsh sunlight, and eyes the color of the summer sky after rain. She surveyed the landscape not with fear, but with genuine curiosity. She was 26 years old, from Adelaide, and she had come to serve as governess for the station owner's children. She represented everything that should have been forbidden to him. White, educated, respectable, yet she looked at him. As she stood beside the truck, she turned and met his gaze directly. Her eyes held his, for 3 heartbeats. 4-5, long enough for something to pass between them that neither could name. Then she turned away, and Jarrah told himself it meant nothing. He was wrong. In the weeks that followed, Margaret began to appear in places where Jarrah worked. At first, he dismissed these encounters as coincidence, but then she began to ask questions. Simple questions at first, about plants and animals. Then deeper questions about the country itself, about how his people understood this ancient landscape. "You speak of the land as if it were alive," she observed one afternoon, as they stood near a waterhole watching pelicans drift across its surface. "It is alive," Jarrah replied. "My grandfather taught me that country is not something we own. It is something we belong to. It holds the stories of our ancestors, the paths they walked, the places where they were born and where they returned to the earth. That is a beautiful way to understand the world. It is the only way I know." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jarrah saw something in her expression that made his heart pound. There was no condescension in her gaze, no pity. There was only genuine interest, and something warmer, something dangerous. He should have walked away. He knew the rules of the world they inhabited. He knew what happened to Aboriginal men who forgot their place. He knew that this path led only to destruction. But loneliness has a weight that eventually becomes unbearable. And Margaret Whitford was offering him something he had not felt in 15 years, connection. Their conversations continued. They met by accident that stopped being accidental. They walked together in the early mornings and late evenings, always careful, always aware that they existed in a world that would not understand. Jarrah did not know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways that would test everything he believed about love, loss, and the possibility of belonging. What awaited him would break his heart and rebuild it, would challenge every assumption and reward every risk. The red dust of the territory continued to settle on everything, carrying whispers of stories yet to be told. And somewhere in the vast Australian sky, the stars that had witnessed the dreaming itself prepared to witness something equally ancient, the slow, dangerous, inevitable awakening of a wounded heart. Fate had plans for Jarrah Mundine, and fate was only just beginning. "Miss Whitford, you need to stop. Right now, before it is too late." The words hit Margaret like a slap. She had entered the kitchen expecting nothing more than a cup of tea, and instead found Betty, the station cook, blocking her path with an expression that mixed concern with genuine fear. "I beg your pardon." Betty glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone, then stepped closer. Her weathered hands gripped Margaret's arm with surprising strength. "People are talking. About you and that Aboriginal stockman. About the walks you take together. The way you look at each other when you think no one is watching." Betty's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "Miss, I have worked on this station for 20 years. I have seen things. I have seen what happens to people who cross certain lines. You do not understand the danger you are putting yourself in. Both of you." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Jarrah has shown me nothing but respect. He has taught me about this land, about its history. There is nothing improper in our conversations." "It does not matter what is proper or improper between you," Betty replied. "It matters what people believe. It matters what they see. And what they see is a young white woman spending far too much time with an Aboriginal man." She released Margaret's arm, but her eyes remained intense. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I am saying this because I do not want to see you destroyed. Either of you." Margaret stood in silence as Betty returned to her work at the stove. The cook's words echoed in her mind long after she left the kitchen, long after the sun had set and risen again, but she did not stop. She could not. Something had awakened inside her during those walks with Jarrah, something that had been dormant throughout her careful, constrained life in Adelaide. He spoke to her as an equal. He shared knowledge that revealed depths of understanding she had never encountered in drawing rooms or lecture halls, and when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that made her wonder if anyone had ever truly seen her before. The wet season arrived with sudden force that year. Thunderheads built along the horizon each afternoon, massive towers of cloud that transformed the sky into a cathedral of light and shadow. When the rains came, they reshaped the landscape. Dry creek beds became rushing torrents. The red earth darkened and softened. The Spinifex plains erupted with wildflowers in colors so vivid they seemed painted by a divine hand. During the storms, Margaret found herself thinking of Jarrah. She imagined him in his solitary hut, watching the same lightning through gaps in the corrugated iron. She wondered what stories his people told about the thunder, what meaning they found in the violence of the weather. Their conversations had deepened over the weeks. What had begun as questions about plants and animals had evolved into something far more intimate. Jarrah had begun to share stories from the great body of knowledge his grandfather had passed to him. He spoke of the dreaming, that vast network of creation stories that connected every rock, every river, every living thing to a time when the world was sung into existence. "Your grandfather sounds like a remarkable man," Margaret said one afternoon, as they sheltered beneath a coolibah tree while a brief shower passed overhead. The rain drummed against the leaves, creating a curtain of water that enclosed them in their own private world. Jarrah nodded slowly. He carried knowledge that stretched back through countless generations. When he passed, much of that knowledge went with him. I hold only fragments now, pieces of a larger story that I can no longer fully reconstruct. That must be a profound loss. He looked at her with surprise. In his experience, white people rarely acknowledged Aboriginal grief as real or significant. "It is," he admitted. "Sometimes I feel as though I am a book with half its pages torn away. I know there is more to the story, but I cannot access it." "Perhaps you can write new pages," she said softly. "Perhaps the story is not finished." They looked at each other with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged, electric, dangerous. That evening, after the station had settled into its nighttime quiet, Margaret slipped out of the homestead and made her way to the western paddock. She knew Jarrah would be there. He had told her it was his favorite place to watch the sunset, to feel connected to country in the fading light. She found him sitting on a flat rock overlooking a waterhole that had filled with the day's rain. The water reflected the colors of the sky, creating a mirror image of the sunset that seemed to stretch into infinity. "I hoped you would come," he said without turning. "I was afraid you would not." Margaret sat beside him on the rock. Their shoulders touched and neither moved away. "Jarrah, I need to ask you something. I need to know what this is between us. I need to know if I am imagining it, if I am foolish to feel what I feel." For a long moment he did not answer. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he had spent years learning to suppress. "I have been alone for most of my life. I accepted that loneliness was my portion. I built walls around my heart because I knew that to love was to risk loss, and I had lost too much already." He paused, gathering courage. "Then you arrived, and you looked at me as if I were a person, not a shadow, as if I mattered." "You do matter," Margaret whispered. "What I feel for you is something I never expected to feel again. It terrifies me, but I cannot deny it any longer." He took a breath. "I love you, Margaret. I have loved you since the moment you first spoke to me as an equal. I will love you until I draw my last breath." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "I love you too. I do not care what the world thinks. I do not care about the rules and the expectations. I care about you." Jarrah reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. In the fading light, Margaret could see it was a pendant, carved from pale wood, worn smooth by generations of handling. "This belonged to my mother," he said, placing it in her palm, "and to her mother before her. It has been passed down through my family for longer than memory reaches. I have carried it since the day she died, waiting for the moment when I would know what to do with it." Margaret looked at the pendant with understanding dawning in her eyes. "If you accept this, you accept more than a gift. You accept a connection to everything I am, everything my family was, everything we might become together. You accept the risks and the difficulties." His voice broke slightly. "And you give me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope." Margaret closed her fingers around the carved wood. It was warm from being held close to his heart. "I accept," she said. "I accept all of it." She leaned toward him, and he met her halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the space of a heartbeat. The second kiss was deeper, carrying the weight of everything they had confessed, everything they had risked. Above them, the first stars of evening appeared in a sky fading from gold to purple. The same stars that had witnessed the dreaming now witnessed this, two people from different worlds choosing each other despite everything. They did not see the figure watching from the shadows of the mulga trees 50 meters away. They did not notice the station foreman, Douglas Reeves, who had followed Margaret out of suspicion and witnessed everything. Reeves stood in the darkness, his face hard with disapproval. What he had seen violated everything he believed about the proper order of society. This could not be permitted. He turned and walked back toward the station buildings, composing in his mind the words he would say to Harold Pemberton in the morning. But on that starlit evening, Jarrah and Margaret knew nothing of what was to come. They walked back toward the station hand in hand, separating only when they reached the area visible from the homestead windows. "Whatever happens," Margaret said softly, "remember that I chose this. I chose you, and I choose you, whatever the cost." The wet season rains continued to fall, reshaping the land as surely as love was reshaping two human hearts. And somewhere in the darkness, a storm of a different kind was gathering, one that would test everything they had pledged beneath the ancient stars. Douglas Reeves had not slept well. The images from the previous evening played over and over in his mind, the white woman and the Aboriginal stockman holding hands, kissing in the fading light, as if the world and its rules meant nothing to them. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. He presented himself at Harold Pemberton's study at 7 o'clock the following morning, before the station had fully awakened to the day's work. "This had better be important," Harold said, not looking up from the papers spread across his desk. "It is, sir. It concerns your governess." Now Harold looked up, his eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. "What about Miss Whitford?" Reeves told him everything, the walks he had observed over recent weeks, the conversations that seemed far too intimate for mere acquaintances, and finally what he had witnessed the previous evening by the waterhole, when the last light of day had turned the sky to fire. "They kissed, sir, and he gave her something, some kind of Aboriginal pendant. She accepted it as if it were an engagement ring." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Harold Pemberton's face had gone from its usual weathered tan to a deep, dangerous red that spread from his collar to his receding hairline. "You are absolutely certain of what you saw?" "I am, sir. I would not bring this to you otherwise. I know what I witnessed." Harold stood and walked to the window. Outside, the station was coming to life. Workers moved between buildings. Horses were being saddled for the day's muster. Somewhere in the homestead, Margaret Whitford was likely preparing lessons for his children, unaware that her world was about to collapse. "Thank you, Reeves. You did the right thing bringing this to me. Say nothing to anyone else. I will handle it personally." The summons came at 9 o'clock. Margaret was in the middle of a geography lesson, pointing out the rivers of New South Wales on a faded map, when one of the house staff appeared at the schoolroom door with an expression that told her everything she needed to know. "Mr. Pemberton wants to see you in his study, miss, right away." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. She had been expecting this moment since Betty's warning in the kitchen, perhaps even before. She had simply hoped it would not come so soon. "Children, please continue reading chapter 7. I will return shortly." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they might not be true. Harold Pemberton waited in his study with his wife seated beside him. Mrs. Pemberton's face was arranged in an expression of careful concern that did not quite reach her eyes. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and leather, the familiar scent of male authority and unquestioned power. "Please sit down, Miss Whitford." Harold gestured toward a leather chair opposite his desk. Margaret sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble, no matter what was about to happen. "I will speak plainly," Harold continued, his tone clipped and businesslike. "It has come to my attention that you have formed an inappropriate attachment to one of my Aboriginal workers, the stockman called Jarrah Mundine. There is nothing inappropriate about it." The words came out before Margaret could stop them. She saw Harold's face darken further, saw Mrs. Pemberton's hand fly to her chest in theatrical shock. "I beg your pardon? I said there is nothing inappropriate about it." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. "Jarrah is a good man, an honorable man. He has treated me with nothing but respect and dignity." "Respect." Harold slammed his palm on the desk, making the inkwell jump. "Are you call this respect? Carrying on with a white woman behind everyone's backs? Taking liberties that no man of his kind should ever presume to take? He has taken no liberties. Everything between us has been mutual and freely given." Mrs. Pemberton made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "My dear girl, do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you are saying?" "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Pemberton." Margaret met her gaze without flinching. "I'm saying that I have found a man who sees me as I truly am. A man who values my thoughts and respects my opinions. A man whose character is worth more than all the social standing in the world." Harold Pemberton leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold, controlled tone that was somehow more frightening than his earlier outburst. "Let me explain your situation to you, Miss Whitford. You are an employee on my station. If word of this liaison spreads beyond these walls, you will be ruined. No respectable family will hire you, no decent man will marry you. You will be cast out of society entirely. Is that what you want? Perhaps I do not want a place in a society that would judge me for loving a good man. The word hung in the air like smoke. Loving. She had said it aloud in front of witnesses. There was no taking it back now. Very well. Harold's voice was ice. I will give you a choice. Cease all contact with this man immediately, and we will forget this episode occurred. Or leave this station tomorrow morning and face the consequences of your foolishness alone. Margaret thought of Jarrah, of his gentle voice, of his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, of the kiss they had shared beneath the stars. She thought of everything she would lose, and then she thought of everything she had found. I understand, she said, rising from her chair, and I cannot accept your terms. She walked out before they could respond. She made it to her small room, closed the door, and collapsed onto the bed. And then she allowed herself to shake. Jarrah learned of her dismissal that evening. His reaction surprised her. You should not have done this. His voice was rough, almost angry. You have thrown away everything. For what? For a man who cannot give you anything. For a man I love. Love is not enough. Love does not put food on the table. Love does not protect you from cruelty. Margaret placed her hand on his shoulder. Jarrah, look at me. He turned slowly. She could see tears in his eyes. You told me you loved me. Was that true? You know it was. Then trust that love. I knew what I was giving up. I also know what I am gaining. A life that is real. A life with you. It will not be easy. The world will fight against us. Then we will be broken together. And we will put each other back together again. He pulled her close. I do not deserve you. You deserve far more than I can give. But I will spend my life trying. The following morning, Margaret loaded her possessions onto the supply truck. The Pemberton children stood on the veranda, confused and tearful. Why are you leaving? The youngest asked. Did we do something wrong? Margaret knelt down. You did nothing wrong. But remember something. Always follow your heart even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult. Betty pressed a package into her hands. Food for the journey. I hope I was wrong about everything. Jarrah was not permitted to see her off, but as the truck pulled away, she saw him standing on a distant ridge, a solitary figure against the sky. She pressed her hand against the window, and she thought she saw him raise his hand in return. The road stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Margaret was traveling towards something she had chosen for herself, and somewhere in the outback, plans were being made. Plans that would bring them back together and reshape their lives forever. 3 months had passed since Margaret arrived in Catherine. 3 months of working at the general store, stocking shelves by day and writing letters by candlelight at night. 3 months of waiting for replies that came through unofficial channels, passed from hand to hand by Aboriginal stockmen, who understood that some connections could not be broken by distance or disapproval. Mrs. Gallagher, the widow who ran the boarding house, had become something like a mother to her. She asked no questions about why a young governess from Adelaide had arrived with no references and no prospects. She simply offered a room and a kind word, and expected nothing in return but basic decency and occasional help with the washing. It was Mrs. Gallagher who handed her the letter that changed everything. Came through this morning, she said, her Irish eyes twinkling with barely contained curiosity. From that stockman of yours, I expect. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. She had received letters from Jarrah before, brief messages of love and longing, but this one was different. She could tell from the weight of it, the careful way it had been sealed. She read it twice, unable to believe the words on the page. Then she read it a third time and tears began streaming down her face. Good news or bad? Mrs. Gallagher asked gently. He has found a position, Margaret whispered, on a station further west. The owner is a Scottish man who judges workers by their abilities, not their ancestry. There is a cottage included with the position. She looked up, her face shining with disbelief and joy. He is asking me to marry him. Mrs. Gallagher crossed herself and smiled. Well then, I suppose we had better start planning a wedding. The arrangements were made in secret. Marriage between an Aboriginal man and a white woman was not explicitly forbidden by law in the Northern Territory, but it was socially unthinkable. They would need to find a minister willing to perform the ceremony, and a location far enough from prying eyes to avoid interference. Mrs. Gallagher knew a man. The Reverend Thomas Aldridge had served in remote communities for 30 years, and he had long ago concluded that God's love made no distinction between skin colors. He agreed to marry them in a small church on the outskirts of Darwin. Jara sent word that 2 Aboriginal elders, men named William and Ernest who had known his grandfather, would serve as witnesses. In the absence of his lost family, these men would represent continuity with his heritage and his ancestors. The journey to Darwin took 2 days by coach. Margaret spent the hours staring out the window at the passing landscape, thinking about everything that had led her to this moment. The dust and heat of Millbrook Station. The first time Jara had looked at her, really looked at her. The kiss beneath the stars. The confrontation in Pemberton's study. The long months of separation. And now this. A new beginning. A future she had chosen. The church stood at the edge of town, surrounded by palm trees that whispered in the tropical breeze. It was small and plain, with whitewashed walls and wooden pews worn smooth by generations. Not the grand cathedral Margaret's mother had always imagined. But to Margaret, it was perfect. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Gallagher had helped her select. Her honey-colored hair was pinned beneath a small hat with a single white flower. Around her neck, she wore Jara's mother's pendant. Reverend Aldridge met her at the door with a warm smile. "The groom is already inside. I must say I have rarely seen a man so nervous. He is afraid you will change your mind." "Never," Margaret said. "Not in 1,000 years." She entered the church. Mrs. Gallagher sat on one side, dabbing her eyes. The 2 Aboriginal elders sat on the other, their weathered faces solemn and watchful, and there stood Jara. Clean white shirt, dark trousers purchased with years of savings. His hands trembled. When he saw her approaching, the sadness that lived behind his eyes lifted completely, replaced by joy so pure it stole her breath. She reached his side and took his hand. Reverend Aldridge began the ceremony. He spoke of love that transcended boundaries, of the courage required to follow one's heart. Then he paused. "I must ask if anyone present knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage." The silence stretched. Margaret heard footsteps outside, the creak of the church door. Terror flooded through her. Had someone come to stop them? But it was only a late arrival. A young Aboriginal woman slipping into the back pew. She caught Margaret's eye and nodded in silent blessing. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Jara kissed his bride. Behind them, Mrs. Gallagher wept openly. The elders nodded their approval. They were married. Against all odds, they were married. Wandara Station was smaller than Millbrook, but better managed. Angus MacLeod, the Scottish owner, extended his hand with genuine warmth. "Jara Mundine, I have heard good things about your work. Welcome." He turned to Margaret. "And Mrs. Mundine, we can find work for you too if you wish it." Their cottage was small but solid. 2 rooms, a veranda overlooking the hills. To Margaret, it was everything. "Our home," Jara said softly. Words I never thought I would say. The months that followed were the happiest either had known. And then came the news that changed everything again. Margaret was expecting a child. She waited until evening to tell Jara. She found him on the veranda, watching the stars. "I have something to tell you, something wonderful." He turned, and she saw fear leap into his eyes before she spoke. "You are carrying our child." "Yes." She had expected joy. Instead, his face crumpled with terror. He gripped the veranda railing until his knuckles went white. "Jara, what is wrong?" For a long moment, silence. Then his voice came, barely a whisper. "I am thinking of Miriam and Ruth, the morning they were taken. I was in the fields when I heard screaming. I ran as fast as I could, but I was too late. They were already in the vehicle. Miriam was calling my name. Ruth was frozen with shock." He turned to face her, tears streaming down his face. "They take Aboriginal children, Margaret. They call it protection, but it is theft. They steal them from their families. And now we are having a child who is part Aboriginal, a child they could take from us." Margaret took his hands firmly in hers. "The world is changing, Jara. They cannot take our child. You do not know that. I cannot lose another family. I cannot survive it again. Listen to me." Her voice was fierce with determination. "Our child will be born in love, raised in love, and no one will take our child from us. I will die before I let that happen. Do you understand me?" He looked into her eyes and saw the warrior there. This woman had sacrificed everything. She would fight governments if necessary. He pulled her into his arms. I'm sorry. I should be happy. I am happy. But the fear... I know. We will face it together. All of it. They stood together as the stars wheeled overhead, two people who had defied every expectation and found each other against impossible odds. The child growing within Margaret carried the heritage of two peoples, two histories, two ways of understanding the world, and somewhere in the vastness of the outback, fate was preparing one final revelation. A revelation that would prove that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that sometimes, just sometimes, what was lost can be found again. The country watched and waited, keeping secrets that would soon demand to be revealed. The child came into the world on a morning in early April, when the first hints of the dry season cooled the tropical air. She announced her arrival with a lusty cry that echoed across the station. She was a girl, with her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's dark, knowing eyes. They named her Eleanor, after Margaret's grandmother, but called her Ellie from the first moment she drew breath. Jarrah held his daughter with hands that had gentled countless animals, that had worked the red earth since childhood. Now those hands cradled something infinitely more precious. "She is beautiful," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She is perfect." "She has your eyes," Margaret said, exhausted but radiant. "She will see the world the way you see it." The months that followed were filled with ordinary miracles. Ellie grew quickly, her personality emerging in small gestures that delighted everyone. She laughed easily and cried rarely. The station community embraced the child with unexpected warmth. Angus MacLeod became a surrogate grandfather, visiting regularly to bounce Ellie on his knee and tell her stories of Scotland. It was during one of these visits, when Ellie was 6 months old, that Angus arrived with news that would change everything. "A woman has come to the main house," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "She claims to be your sister, Jarrah." The world stopped. Jarrah went very still. His hands, which had been holding Ellie, tightened involuntarily. Margaret reached out to take the baby. "My sister," he repeated, barely audible. "Which one?" "She says her name is Sarah Collins now. But she was born Miriam Mundine. She has been searching for you for years." Miriam. The name hit Jarrah like a physical blow. 15 years since he had watched her being dragged to that government vehicle. 15 years since he had collapsed in the dust, screaming her name. "Where is she?" "At the main house. I can send her away if you need time." "No." Jarrah's voice cracked. "Bring her here. Please." The hour that followed was the longest of his life. He paced the cottage, unable to sit. Then came the knock at the door. He opened it with trembling hands. She was a woman now, not the terrified 10-year-old he remembered. In her late 20s, with features that unmistakably echoed his own. But there was something else there too, a profound sadness, a weariness that spoke of years of struggle. For a long moment, brother and sister simply stared at each other. Then Miriam spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You got big." It was such an absurd thing to say, but it broke something open inside Jarrah. A sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob, and then he was pulling her into his arms. "I looked for you," he choked out. "I never stopped looking. I know, they hid us. They changed our names. They told us our families did not want us. Never. I never abandoned you, not for a single day." When the storm of emotion had passed, they moved inside. Jarrah sat beside his sister, their hands clasped together. "Tell me everything," he said. "I need to know." Miriam told her story. She had been taken to a mission in South Australia. They had stripped away her name, her language, every trace of her identity. "They told us we would have better lives if we became like white people. I believed them for a long time. I forgot our mother's face. I forgot the stories you used to tell me. But you remembered something," Margaret said gently. Miriam nodded. "There was an elder at the mission, an old woman named Gladys. She had been taken from country when she was young, but she never forgot who she was. She told me my family had loved me. She told me my brother had run after the car until he collapsed." "And Ruth?" Jarrah asked, though his voice suggested he already feared the answer. Miriam's face crumpled. "Ruth did not survive. She was only 6 when they took us. Too young, too fragile. She stopped eating, stopped speaking. She passed away when she was 14. They said it was illness, but I was there. She died of a broken heart." The silence that followed was heavy with grief. Another loss, another wound that would never heal. Then Jarrah suddenly pulled away. There was something in his expression, a realization dawning. "Wait here," he said. "There is something I need to get." He disappeared into the bedroom and returned carrying a small carved wooden box. He sat beside his sister and opened it with reverent care. "Do you remember this?" He held up a smooth stone. Miriam's eyes widened. "Mum's stone, the one she said had been blessed before you were born. And this?" "A feather, carefully preserved. Grandfather's feather." Jarrah reached into the box one final time and withdrew something small, a woven bracelet made of native grasses, faded but still intact. Miriam gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "My bracelet," she whispered. "I was wearing it when they took us. I thought it was lost forever. It fell from your wrist as they dragged you to the car." Jarrah's voice was thick with emotion. "I found it in the dust after you were gone. I have kept it with me every day since, waiting." "Waiting for what?" "Waiting for the day I could give it back to you." He placed the bracelet in her palm. It was a small thing, this circle of woven grass, but it represented something immense: connection, memory, love that had survived 15 years of separation. Miriam closed her fingers around it and began to weep. Not with sadness, but with the overwhelming joy of being found. A baby's cry interrupted them. Ellie had woken from her nap. Miriam looked at the child with wonder. "Your daughter?" "Yes." Jarrah lifted Ellie and placed her in Miriam's arms. "This is Eleanor. She carries both our heritage and her mother's." Miriam stared at the baby. "She looks like Mum. She has Mum's mouth." "I thought so too." Miriam stayed at Wandara. Angus MacLeod offered her employment and she accepted. She became a regular presence in their lives, helping with Ellie, slowly rebuilding the sibling bond that had been so cruelly disrupted. Together, Jarrah and Miriam began teaching Ellie about her Aboriginal heritage. They shared fragments of their language, their stories, their connection to country. One evening, as the family sat watching another spectacular sunset, Jarrah spoke words that seemed to summarize everything. "I spent most of my life believing I was defined by what I had lost. My mother, my father, my sisters. I thought loneliness was my destiny." He looked at Margaret, at Miriam, at the child in his sister's arms. "I was wrong. What defines us is not what we lose, but what we choose to love despite the risk of loss. I chose to love Margaret. I chose to hope for a family, and because of those choices, I have been given gifts beyond anything I could have imagined." The sun disappeared below the horizon. In a small cottage at the edge of a territory station, a family sat together in the gathering dusk. They had been broken by history, scattered by cruelty, but they had found their way back to each other, and the country, the living country that Jarrah's ancestors had walked since time beyond memory, seemed to whisper its approval on the wind. They belonged to each other now. That was the greatest gift of all.